Good afternoon, Year 11. Today we're going to prepare ourselves for English Literature Paper 2. On English Literature Paper 2, there are 3 sections. Section A, an inspector calls. Section B, power and conflict poetry. And Section C, unseen poetry. As you know, this exam will take place on Monday, the 20th of May. The front of the exam will look like this. It will tell you how long that you've got, so time allowed 2 hours 15, and it will also tell you about the paper, and it will remind you to answer one question from section A, one question from section B, and both questions in section C. It also then tells you the marks again for each one, including a reminder that there are 4 marks available for section A in spectacles when you are marked for your use of a range of vocabulary and sentence starters for clarity, purpose and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. When you turn over the booklet and you will see the contents page, you will see what the questions listed for section A, B and C. So for section A, you can see all the modern prose and drama that will be taught across the nation. But we have studied an inspector calls. So you need to make sure that you highlight or draw your attention to that you only need to answer the question, one of the questions on page 4. For section B, there's either love and relationships or power and conflict. You only need to choose the power and conflict question to complete. And for section C, for unseen poetry, there are 2 questions to answer, 27.1, which is 24 marks, and 27.2, which is the comparison of 2 unseen poems for 8 marks. So let's have a look at inspector calls first. For inspector calls, you'll get a choice of 2 questions. These 2 questions look at 2 different things. So the first question looks at a character, whereas the second one looks more at a theme. So we don't know exactly what will come up on the exam. It could be 2 characters, it could be 2 theme questions, or it could be a character or a theme question. So the first question example here says, how far does Priestley present Eric as a character who learns important lessons about society in Inspector Calls? And you can see I've highlighted or underlined the things that you might highlight in the exam. And it says, write about what Eric says and does in the play and how Priestley presents Eric. Or, number 2, Priestley shows how inequality in society leads to tragedy. How far do you agree with this view of an Inspector Calls and write about what happens in the play and how Priestley presents what happens in the play? So with Eric, you might bring in wider themes such as the class divide, exploitation that Eric later is part of. It might look at the fact that he represents the younger generation. Whereas in the theme question on the bottom, where Priestley shows how inequality in society leads to tragedy, you would most likely bring in characters that alongside that theme and other themes that link back to that idea of inequality. Once you've highlighted the key information in each question, it's important you choose which question you are going to answer. There is no reason why you should choose one over the other, apart from that you feel more confident about answering one of the questions rather than another. It is important that you plan your response, and you might do that by noting down 3 or 4 big ideas related to the question, and note down textual references or quotes to support your big ideas. With both a theme or character question, it is important to consider and to communicate how the theme or character changes throughout the play. I'm going to share how I would approach an Eric question. So Eric is a dramatic construct that symbolises the capacity the younger generation has to change, their ability to take responsibility and learn from their mistakes to create a fairer society. It is important to note that when you talk about any of the characters that are created in this play, you talk about them as if they are a construct, and because it is a play, you can talk about them as being dramatic constructs. Eric is conditioned by his parents and society to conform to the patriarchy. He's clearly not quite at ease with his family or his past actions and resorts to getting squiffy to escape the reality of his situation. He is introduced in the stage directions as half shy, half assertive, depicting a character who is immature and is yet to be whole. This is very similar to Sheila. Sheila is also depicted or introduced to us as half serious, half playful. Both of the younger generation are mouldable through this description. In Act 1, Eric is quick to speak out against his father's actions, questioning why Eva and the factory girls shouldn't try for higher wages. But Eric exploits Eva Smith-Daisy Renton and does so because he was in a state where a chap easily turns nasty. Eric acted immorally but demonstrates remorse and attempts to make up for his mistakes by stealing off his father. By the end, Eric promotes the importance of collective responsibility, shouting at his family that they all helped to kill her. Just like Literature Paper 1, it is important that once you have planned and noted down some of your ideas and quotations that you might use or references to support your big ideas, that you begin your response with an introduction. You engage with the key words in the question and connect that to the text. And you might start that with the fronted adverbial undoubtedly. Then you talk about how does the theme or character develop across the play as a whole. That's so important. And then finally, in your final sentence, you need to refer back to the question and talk about the writer's intentions. Consequently, Priestley appears to be in order to. Don't forget at the end of your introduction and at the end of every paragraph to refer back to the writer's intentions, that you will talk about things like that horrified by the treatment of the lower classes, Priestley uses an inspector calls to criticise the societal structure. He might have written inspector calls to reduce the extreme divide between the upper class and the destitute lower class. He might be protesting against the patriarchy and the way that it restricted the freedom of women and the choices that they had. He may be criticising how male dominance and the abuse of women was often overlooked or accepted. He may have hoped to incite society to take responsibility for their actions and their impact on others. He might want to encourage the younger generations to break free from the conditioned mindset of their parents and embrace equality in society. Ultimately, Priestley was a social reformer. He wanted social change, and through Inspector Calls, he looks at these different ideas. It is important, like with when we studied Macbeth and A Christmas Carol, and we prepared for that exam, we reminded you to ensure that when you discuss writers' intentions, you do so tentatively, with words like perhaps, possibly, it is likely. Once you have finished your Inspector Calls response, it is important to check for any mistakes or errors. Make sure that you have included commas. When you've used your fronted adverbials, make sure that you start with capital letters. The simple things are sometimes the things that we forget. And whilst it might seem silly that I'm saying this, sometimes in the heat of the moment, these things can be forgotten. So please do go and check back in case you do lack the clarity in what you've written down. So now we're going to move on to Power and Conflict Poetry, Section B. In Section B, Power and Conflict Poetry, you will be given one poem from the Power and Conflict cluster, and this will be printed in the booklet. You need to compare this to another poem from memory. You will be given a list of all the poems and the names of the poets in the question booklet. And look at this to help make your choice of comparison. So when you look at the question, just like before, highlight the key important information from the question. So this question says, compare how poets present the ways people are affected by difficult experiences in Remains and in one of the poem from Power and Conflict. When planning your response, you need to reread the named poem and note down two big ideas that the poet is exploring. You may also want to use that moment to highlight or underline any key quotes, words, references that would support your big ideas. Decide which poem you are going to compare the named poem to and note down a big idea or two big ideas that will form the basis of your response, and find in your memory the quotes or references that might support those big ideas. When writing your essay, everybody needs to include an introduction that introduces two poems, because that is the point of the question, to talk about two poems and their big ideas in your response. If you're aiming for a grade 4 to 6, you need to include the structure on the left there. So introduction, idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, but you can see we go from introduction, you'll talk about both poems, then idea 1 from named poem, idea 2 from your chosen poem, and idea 3 from your named poem. In your conclusion, you can include your writer's intentions, talk about what it means to be a human and society and how that's explored in the poem. For grade 7+, in your introduction, make sure that you compare both poems. Use idea 1 and then a named poem, idea 2 chosen poem, idea 3 named poem, idea 4 chosen poem, and then a conclusion, writer's intentions, talk about the human condition and society. Those of you that are trying to get higher grades, it is important that you try to link your ideas between the paragraphs, between idea 1 and idea 2. This is something that you may have practiced in your lesson, so please remember to do that. When writing your introduction, you could begin with, how has the poet presented ideas linked to the question in your poem that has been given to you, the named poem? You might start with, arguably, poet's name and the poem's name is attempting to highlight and then link to the big ideas that you're about to explore. Then in your second sentence, you discuss how do these ideas compare, similarities or differences to your second poem, whilst name the poem that you've chosen, and the poet also provides a commentary on, but focuses more intently on. Why do you think then, in your third sentence, why do you think the poets chose to represent the power of nature in this way, if it was the power of nature? What warning is being given to the reader, or how is part of society being criticised? So consequently, it is likely they are criticising, and finish that off. The big ideas that you could include when discussing poetry could be one of these three: the power of nature, power of people, power of conflict. In the power of nature, we think about the idea of humans are hubristic, and nature reminds us that we are subservient to it. In the power of people, people abuse their power, oppression causes suffering, or resistance to oppression is empowering. When we look at the power of conflict, conflict causes suffering, mental and/or physical, and the impact of conflict is so powerful it can reach those away from the battlefield. Furthermore, other big ideas that you could include are the power of memory. Memory can be both a source of comfort and pain. The act of remembering can be an act of power or resistance. For the power of identity, you could include the idea oppressive institutions and individuals attempt to shape identities in order to control. And in times of conflict, individual identity can be reshaped. It is important that you refer and compare the big ideas to the two poems that you discuss in your essay. In section C, unseen poetry. As I've already discussed, you will get 2 questions for unseen poetry on 2 poems that you haven't ever seen before. So in the first question, it will say something like, how does the poet present ideas about, and there will be a theme or an idea given to you, and you'll be looking at one poem and that idea, and that will be for 24 marks. And then in the second unseen poetry question, you'll be comparing the use of methods to convey their ideas in both poems, and that will be for 8 marks. It's important that you try not to leave any questions out, and you attempt to do all of the questions in the allotted time to maximise your chance of success. So just like before, I would highlight the most important information in the questions for both 27.1 and 27.2. It's really important to go to the question first in unseen poetry because it usually gives you a hint about what the poem will be about. So In I am offering this poem, how does the poet present the speaker's feelings about love? So when you read that poem, you know there's going to be information about love. And you can see here in 27.2, in both The Sun Has Burst the Sky and I Am Offering This Poem, the speakers describe their feelings about love. What are the similarities and or differences between the methods the poets use to present these ideas or these feelings? So what to include in your response for 27.1? For the 24 marks, you need to ensure that you're hitting AO1 and AO2. So in AO1, you're thinking about including the ideas and opinions linked to the question, and for AO2 you discuss the language that the poet has chosen. You can talk about structure too, although this is not essential, but if you do choose to try to include structure, you could think about the opening and the end of the poem and any changes within it. To structure your response for 27.2, you need to compare the first unseen poem you have written an essay on already with a second unseen poem. The recommended structure to compare is both, however. You are assessed on exploring ideas and analysing methods in both poems linked to the question. Finally, it is important to remember that on this paper you choose one question to answer for an inspector calls and only write a response for that one question. Answer the power and conflict question only. Do not answer the question of love and relationships, and make sure that you answer both unseen poetry questions. We wish you the very best of luck. Thank you, Year 11.